I'm Edward, here to keep you company as the day winds down. Tonight, greetings to Florida. Let us know where you're listening from, and we'll say hello to another place next time. Subscribe so you can return for a new story every day. Now, settle back, the mystery begins. Chapter 1. A Village That Trusted Without Question. Lower Hartfield presented itself to the casual observer as a village entirely at peace with its own quiet routines. The main street curved gently between stone cottages whose gardens showed the careful attention of generations, and the church of St. Cuthbert stood at the far end, its square Norman tower visible from every approach to the village. It was the sort of place, Miss Marple reflected as she descended from the afternoon bus, where very little appeared to change from one year to the next, and where that unchanging quality was regarded not as stagnation, but as a considerable virtue. She had accepted the invitation of her old friend Mrs. Dewsbury with some pleasure. Eleanor, her Dewsbury had been a schoolfellow many years ago, and though their paths had diverged considerably since those early days, they had maintained a correspondence of the sort that made such visits feel less like reunions and more like the resumption of a conversation merely paused. Mrs. Dewsbury now lived in a pleasant cottage near the village green, her husband having passed away some 3 years previously, and she had written to suggest that the early autumn might be a particularly agreeable time for Miss Marple to come and stay. The village itself seemed to justify Eleanor's enthusiasm. As Miss Marple made her way along the main street, her small suitcase in hand, she observed the sort of details that had long been her habit to notice. The post office appeared to serve also as the general shop, with a carefully lettered sign advertising that it stocked everything from stamps to sugar. The Rose and Crown stood opposite, its hanging sign freshly painted. A small school could be glimpsed down a side lane, its playground empty at this hour, though the sound of children's voices drifted faintly from within. What struck Miss Marple most particularly, however, was the manner in which people acknowledged one another. A woman emerging from the post office paused to speak with another, crossing the street, and though Miss Marple could not hear their words, she observed the nods, the smiles, the comfortable familiarity of those who had known each other all their lives. A man touched his cap to an elderly lady walking with a basket, and she inclined her head in return with a graciousness that suggested the gesture was not mere politeness, but part of an understood social order. Mrs. Dewsbury's cottage proved as welcoming as her letters had promised. Eleanor herself came to the door before Miss Marple had quite reached it, her face alight with genuine pleasure. "My dear Jane, how very good to see you. You look remarkably well. The journey wasn't too tiring, I hope. Do come in. I've made sure the fire is lit in your room, though the weather has been quite mild, really. Still, one can't be too careful at this time of year." The sitting room into which Miss Marple was soon ushered was precisely the sort of room she had expected. Comfortable chairs, pleasant watercolours on the walls, and the indefinable atmosphere of a house that was well cared for without being in any way ostentatious. Tea appeared almost immediately, accompanied by seed cake that was, Miss Marple had to acknowledge, exceptionally good. "You must tell me all about St. Mary Mead," Eleanor said, settling herself opposite Miss Marple with evident satisfaction. "I do so enjoy your letters, but there's nothing quite like hearing the news properly." Miss Marple provided a careful summary of recent events in her own village, conscious that Eleanor was waiting for her turn with barely concealed anticipation. It was not long in coming. "Of course, Lower Hartfield is considerably smaller than St. Mary Mead," Eleanor began, "but we have our own particular character, I think. Everyone knows everyone else, which is both a comfort and occasionally a slight inconvenience if you understand me. But on the whole, we're very fortunate." "You have a church, I observed," Miss Marple said. "St. Cuthbert, if I read the board correctly." "Oh, yes, and we're particularly blessed in our vicar." Eleanor's face assumed an expression of genuine warmth. "Father Benedict has been with us for nearly 15 years now. Such a help to everyone, and so very tactful in difficult situations. He has a way of settling matters that might otherwise become awkward. People trust him absolutely." Miss Marple noted the choice of words with the quiet attention she habitually gave to such things. Trust given absolutely was sometimes trust that had not been questioned, and trust unquestioned could occasionally prove to have been misplaced. Still, she merely smiled and inquired whether the parish was a large one. Not very large, no, but Father Benedict manages to know everyone personally. He calls regularly, not just upon the elderly or infirm, but upon all of us. He takes a genuine interest, you see. When there are family difficulties or questions about how to proceed in delicate matters, people consult him. His advice is always so sound, so sensible. I really don't know what some people would do without him. Over the following days, Miss Marple had ample opportunity to observe the truth of Eleanor's assertion. Father Benedict's name appeared in conversation with remarkable frequency. When two neighbours disagreed about the placement of a fence, it was suggested that Father Benedict might be asked for his opinion. When a question arose about the most suitable recipient for a charitable donation, Father Benedict was consulted. When a young couple wished to marry but faced opposition from one set of parents, Father Benedict had apparently intervened with such gentleness and wisdom that all parties had been reconciled. He has a particular gift, Mrs. Hartley from the post office explained to Miss Marple when the subject arose during a purchase of stamps, for seeing what's really important. Not everyone has that, you know. Some people get caught up in their own feelings and can't see the broader picture, but Father Benedict always knows what's best for the community as a whole. Miss Marple murmured something appropriately appreciative and observed that it must be very reassuring to have such guidance available. "Oh, it is," Mrs. Hartley agreed warmly. "Why, only last year there was a dreadful misunderstanding about the church fete proceeds. People were becoming quite heated about it, I'm afraid. But Father Benedict called a meeting and explained everything so clearly that everyone felt foolish for having doubted. It was all perfectly above board, of course. He showed us all the accounts himself." It was during Sunday service that Miss Marple first saw Father Benedict in person. He was a man of perhaps 50, with dark hair greying at the temples and a face that conveyed both intelligence and kindness. His voice, when he spoke, was pleasant and measured, and his sermon touched upon the importance of community trust and mutual support. It was, Miss Marple thought, entirely appropriate and delivered with considerable sincerity. What interested her rather more, however, was a small incident she observed as the congregation filed out after the service. Most people stopped to speak with Father Benedict, who stood at the church door offering greetings and accepting invitations to tea with evident pleasure. But one young woman, whom Miss Marple did not recognise, passed by with only the briefest nod and continued walking at a pace that suggested a desire to be away from the church as quickly as possible. The reaction among those nearby was subtle but unmistakable. Mrs. Hartley's eyebrows rose slightly. Another woman whispered something to her companion. An elderly gentleman shook his head in a manner that conveyed disappointment rather than anger. "Who is that young woman?" Miss Marple inquired of Eleanor as they made their own way home. Eleanor's expression became carefully neutral. "That's Emily Shaw. She's recently returned to the village after several years away. Her mother still lives here, poor woman. Emily is her only child." "She doesn't attend church regularly, I gather?" "No." Eleanor's voice carried a note of discomfort. "She used to, of course, before she went away, but since her return she's been rather difficult about it. No one quite knows why. It's caused her mother some distress, I believe." Miss Marple said nothing further on the subject, but she filed the observation away with the particular care she gave to things that didn't quite fit. A village where trust was given so freely was often a village where absence was noticed with considerable attention, and in her experience, when someone withdrew from an activity they had previously embraced, there was usually a reason that went deeper than mere whim or restlessness. That evening, as she sat with her knitting by Eleanor's fire, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the patterns that emerged in any small community. There were always those whose opinions carried weight, whose approval mattered, whose guidance was sought. Such people were often benevolent, genuinely concerned with the welfare of others, but they were also, by virtue of their position, quite powerful in their way, and power, even when wielded with the best of intentions, could sometimes blind those who possessed it to their own failings. She caught herself up with a small smile. Really, she was allowing her imagination to run away with her. Father Benedict was almost certainly exactly what he appeared to be, a devoted clergyman who served his parish well, and Emily Shaw's absence from church was probably nothing more significant than a young woman's temporary rebellion against the expectations of village life. Still, Miss Marple had learned long ago to trust her instincts about such matters, and something in the way people had looked at Emily Shaw, something in the quickness with which they had dismissed her behaviour as unreasonable, suggested that there was more to understand than had yet been explained. She would watch and listen and wait, and if there was indeed something amiss, she would know it when she saw it. Human nature, after all, followed remarkably consistent patterns, whether one observed it in St Mary Mead or in Lower Hartfield, or in any other village in England. The knitting needles clicked steadily in the quiet room, and Miss Marple's expression remained gentle and entirely unremarkable as she considered the days ahead. Chapter 2. A Whisper Heard Only After Prayers. The following Sunday arrived with the soft golden light that sometimes graces early autumn mornings in England, when the air carries a hint of coolness but the sun still holds warmth enough to make sitting outdoors a pleasure. Miss Marple accompanied Eleanor to the morning service at St Cuthbert's, and observed with quiet interest the manner in which the congregation assembled. It was, she reflected, rather like watching a familiar dance. Each person knew precisely where they belonged and moved toward their customary places with the unconscious certainty of long habit. The Hartleys occupied the third pew from the front on the left side. Major Forsyth, a retired military man whom Miss Marple had met briefly at Eleanor's tea table, sat rigidly upright in the second row on the right. The Misses Pemberton, two elderly sisters who lived together in a cottage near the green, settled themselves with considerable rustling of prayer books and hymnals. Emily Shaw did not appear. Her absence was noted, though nothing was said aloud. Miss Marple observed Mrs. Shaw, a thin woman with anxious eyes, glancing toward the church door several times before the service began. When it became clear that her daughter would not arrive, Mrs. Shaw's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly, and she fixed her gaze upon her prayer book with an intensity that suggested she was reading very little of what lay before her. Father Benedict conducted the service with his customary grace. His voice carried well in the stone church, and his manner conveyed both authority and warmth. The sermon touched upon the parable of the prodigal son, emphasizing themes of forgiveness and homecoming. Miss Marple wondered whether this choice of text was entirely coincidental, given Emily Shaw's recent return to the village. It was after the service had concluded, when the congregation lingered in small groups near the churchyard gate, that Miss Marple first heard the whisper take definite shape. She had paused to admire a particularly fine display of Michaelmas daisies when she became aware of a conversation taking place just beyond the hedge. The voices were low, but the morning air carried them with unfortunate clarity. "I do feel for Father Benedict," a woman's voice said. Miss Marple recognised it as belonging to Mrs. Hartley. It must be quite distressing for him. Indeed. This second voice was unfamiliar to Miss Marple, though its tone conveyed both sympathy and a certain eagerness to discuss the matter further. Has he spoken of it at all? Not directly, of course, he wouldn't, but one can see that he's troubled, and really, it's most unfair that he should be placed in such a position. Do we know what actually occurred? There was a pause, and Miss Marple could almost hear the delicate balance being struck between discretion and the desire to share information. "I understand there was some sort of pastoral difficulty," Mrs. Hartley said at last. "Involving Emily Shaw. Before she left the village, I believe. Father Benedict tried to help her naturally, but she appears to have taken offence at something, though what he could possibly have done to warrant such a reaction, I cannot imagine. He's always been kindness itself. Perhaps she misunderstood his intentions. Very likely. Young people can be so sensitive these days. They seem to expect everyone to cater to their feelings without any thought for the awkwardness it creates for others." Miss Marple moved quietly away from the hedge and rejoined Eleanor, who was speaking with the Misses Pemberton about the church flower rota. She made no mention of what she had overheard, but she noted it carefully nonetheless. The pattern was becoming clearer. A difficulty had occurred, though its precise nature remained undefined. Father Benedict was troubled by it. Emily Shaw had taken offence, and the village, presented with these sparse facts, had arranged them into a narrative that cast the vicar as the injured party and the young woman as unreasonable. What interested Miss Marple particularly was how little actual information had been required to construct this interpretation. The facts themselves were neutral: a pastoral difficulty, a young woman's absence from church, a clergyman's apparent distress. But the meaning assigned to these facts had been shaped by something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with pre-existing loyalties. During the week that followed, Miss Marple found occasion to hear several variations on the same theme. At the village shop while purchasing embroidery thread, she listened as two women discussed how difficult it must be for Father Benedict to carry such a burden without complaint. "He never speaks ill of anyone," one of them remarked. "That's what I admire most about him. Even when he has every right to defend himself, he maintains a dignified silence." At tea with the Misses Pemberton, Miss Marple heard Emily Shaw described as having always been rather highly strung. Her mother did tend to indulge her, Miss Pemberton the elder observed, passing the cucumber sandwiches with a slightly disapproving expression. Girls who are given too much freedom often develop unrealistic expectations about life. I'm not at all surprised that she found fault where none existed. "Do you know what the difficulty was?" Miss Marple inquired gently. The sisters exchanged glances. "We don't concern ourselves with gossip," Miss Pemberton the younger said firmly, "but one hears things, naturally. It seems Emily went to Father Benedict for guidance about some personal matter, and when his advice didn't align with what she wished to hear, she became upset. Rather childish, really." "She's always wanted her own way," her sister added, "even as a girl. I remember her in Sunday school questioning everything, never simply accepting what she was told. Some independence of spirit is admirable, of course, but there's a point at which it becomes mere stubbornness." Miss Marple murmured something appropriately sympathetic and turned the conversation to other matters, but she was struck by how much interpretation had been layered upon so little foundation. Emily Shaw's childhood behaviour was being invoked to explain her current actions, as though a child's questions in Sunday school inevitably predicted an adult's unreasonable grievances. It was not until Thursday afternoon, when Eleanor had gone to visit a friend in a neighbouring village, that Miss Marple encountered Emily Shaw directly. She had walked to the post office to purchase stamps and was returning by way of the lane that led past the church, when she observed a young woman sitting alone on a bench beneath an oak tree. Emily Shaw was perhaps 25, with fair hair and a pale, rather strained face. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing in particular, and there was about her an air of profound isolation that touched Miss Marple's sympathies immediately. Miss Marple paused and, after a moment's consideration, approached the bench. "I wonder if I might rest here a moment," she inquired pleasantly. "I'm afraid I've walked rather farther than I intended, and I'm not quite as young as I once was." Emily Shaw looked up, startled, and then shifted slightly to make room. "Of course." Miss Marple settled herself with a small sigh of relief and remarked upon the beauty of the afternoon. Emily responded politely, but without enthusiasm. They sat in silence for a few moments, and then Miss Marple ventured, as though the thought had just occurred to her. "You're Mrs. Shaw's daughter, I believe. I've seen you in the village." "Yes," Emily's voice was carefully neutral. "I'm visiting Mrs. Dewsbury, an old friend of mine. I'm Jane Marple from St. Mary Mead." "I'm pleased to meet you, Miss Marple." There was another pause. Miss Marple appeared to be entirely absorbed in watching a robin that had alighted on a nearby bush. Then she said very gently, "I couldn't help noticing that you seem rather troubled, my dear. Forgive an old woman's curiosity, but is there anything I might do to help?" For a moment, Miss Marple thought Emily would refuse the offer. The young woman's face had become very still and her hands tightened in her lap. But then, quite suddenly, her composure cracked just slightly. "You're very kind," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "But I'm afraid there's nothing anyone can do. Not really. People have made up their minds, and once that happens, the truth doesn't seem to matter very much." About what, my dear? Emily looked at her directly for the first time. Her eyes were dark with something that might have been anger or might have been despair. About Father Benedict, she said quietly. And about me. They think I've accused him of something or that I'm being difficult for no reason. But that's not what happened at all. I can't be near him anymore. I can't sit in that church and listen to him speak about kindness and guidance and trust when I know what it really means, what it really requires. What does it require? Miss Marple asked, her voice very gentle. Emily hesitated, then shook her head. I can't explain it properly. It's not that he did anything illegal, nothing I could prove, nothing anyone would believe, but he made me feel as though I had no choice, as though disagreeing with him meant I was wrong, foolish, ungrateful. And when I finally realised that wasn't true, when I finally left, I thought I'd escaped. But coming back, it's worse somehow. Because now everyone looks at me as though I'm the problem, as though I'm causing trouble simply by refusing to pretend. Pretend what? That everything is fine. That Father Benedict is simply a good man trying to help, that anyone who can't accept his help must be at fault. Miss Marple said nothing for a long moment. She had heard enough to understand the essential truth. Here was a young woman who had been diminished, not by scandal or by anything that could be easily named, but by something far more insidious, the slow erosion of agency disguised as care. I believe you, Miss Marple said at last. Emily Shaw stared at her, and suddenly there were tears in her eyes. You're the first person who has. Miss Marple patted her hand gently. Truth has a way of emerging eventually, my dear, but it requires patience, and sometimes it requires someone to ask the right questions. She rose from the bench, conscious that Eleanor would be returning soon, and that she had much to consider. Emily Shaw thanked her again, and Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the cottage, her mind turning over everything she had heard. The whisper that had begun after Sunday prayers was taking shape, but not in the way the village imagined. The difficulty was real, but its source had been misidentified, and Miss Marple suspected that this misidentification was not accidental, but rather the natural result of a village that had learned to trust without question. And trust unexamined, she reflected, could protect the wrong person entirely. Chapter 3, Sympathy offered in the correct measure. The village tea table, Miss Marple had long ago concluded, was a far more revealing institution than many people realised. It was there that opinions were refined, reputations assessed, and the invisible boundaries of acceptable behaviour quietly reinforced. And it was at precisely such gatherings, over the following week, that she observed how sympathy in Lower Hartfield was distributed with remarkable precision. Mrs. Dewsbury had invited several ladies to tea on Tuesday afternoon, and Miss Marple found herself seated in Eleanor's pleasant sitting-room, alongside Mrs. Hartley, the Mrs. Pemberton, and a Mrs. Venables, who lived in one of the larger houses on the edge of the village and was, Eleanor had mentioned, a considerable supporter of church activities. The conversation began, as such conversations often did, with neutral topics. The weather, naturally, the upcoming harvest festival, a minor disagreement about whether the church roof fund had reached its target. It was Mrs. Venables who introduced the subject that Miss Marple had been expecting. I do hope Father Benedict isn't allowing himself to become too troubled by recent difficulties, she said, setting down her teacup with a delicate clink. He's such a sensitive soul, and I'm certain he takes these matters far more to heart than he ought. It's very unfortunate, Eleanor agreed, passing the plate of shortbread. One wishes people would consider the consequences of their actions before creating such awkwardness. Miss Marple, who was ostensibly occupied with selecting a piece of cake, listened with the particular attention she gave to conversations where much was being conveyed through implication rather than direct statement. Has anyone actually spoken with Emily Shaw about the matter? She inquired, her voice mild and faintly curious. There was a brief silence. The Mrs. Pemberton exchanged glances, Mrs. Hartley shifted slightly in her chair. "I'm not certain that would be wise," Mrs. Venables said at last. "The girl is clearly in a rather fragile state. One wouldn't wish to upset her further." "But surely," Miss Marple suggested gently, "if she's upset it might help to understand why." "Oh, we understand well enough," Mrs. Hartley said, with the confident tone of someone who has reached a conclusion and sees no reason to reconsider it. Emily has always been inclined toward excessive sensitivity. Her mother spoiled her dreadfully as a child, and the result is a young woman who expects the world to accommodate her whims. She was such a pretty little thing, Miss Pemberton the elder added, though her tone suggested this had been more of a disadvantage than otherwise. Pretty children are often indulged, and indulged children rarely develop proper resilience. Miss Marple murmured something non-committal, and observed that it must be difficult for Mrs. Shaw, having her daughter return in such an unsettled state. "Mrs. Shaw is a saint," Mrs. Venables declared. "The patience that woman has shown. Emily barely speaks to her, I'm told. Shuts herself away in her room for hours at a time. It's most inconsiderate." "Perhaps she's troubled about something," Miss Marple ventured. "Of course she's troubled," Eleanor said, with a touch of impatience. "The question is whether she has any real cause to be, or whether she's simply creating drama where none exists. I'm inclined toward the latter view, I must say." "Father Benedict tried so hard to help her," Mrs. Hartley continued. "When she first came to him, he spent hours counselling her, offering guidance, and this is how she repays his kindness, by refusing to even attend church, by making him feel as though he's somehow failed in his pastoral duties." "Has he said he feels that way?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Hartley hesitated. "Well, no, not in so many words. Father Benedict would never burden others with his own difficulties, but one can see it in his face. He looks quite drawn lately." Miss Marple reflected that a man might look drawn for any number of reasons, not all of them connected to feelings of failure. But she merely nodded and turned the conversation to the subject of the church flowers, which proved a safe enough topic to occupy them until the teacups were empty. It was 2 days later, at a different gathering, that Miss Marple observed the same pattern from a different angle. Major Forsyth had invited Eleanor and Miss Marple to sherry at his house, a substantial Georgian building that reflected his military background in its orderly gardens and precisely maintained exterior. His housekeeper served them in the drawing room, and the conversation was initially concerned with matters of local governance. The parish council meeting was rather contentious, the Major observed, his weathered face creasing with disapproval. Young Thornton from the garage wanted to propose some nonsense about street lighting. Father Benedict had to intervene to restore order. "Father Benedict attends the parish council?" Miss Marple inquired. "Not so officially, no. But he often sits in on meetings when matters of community importance are being discussed. His perspective is invariably valuable. Helps us see the broader picture, don't you know?" "He has a gift for that," Eleanor agreed, "for understanding what's truly best for the community as a whole rather than what might benefit one person or another." Miss Marple sipped her sherry and remarked that it must be reassuring to have such guidance available. "Indeed. Though I must say he's seemed rather preoccupied lately. This business with the Shaw girl, I imagine. Unfortunate situation." "Do you know what happened?" Miss Marple asked, with the innocent directness that sometimes encouraged people to speak more freely than they might otherwise. Major Forsyth frowned. "Can't say if I know the details. Not sure anyone does, really. Some sort of misunderstanding, I gather. Father Benedict tried to counsel the girl and she took it the wrong way. Women can be peculiar about these things. No offence intended, Mrs. Dewsbury." "None taken," Eleanor said dryly. "Though I must say, Emily Shaw has always struck me as particularly prone to imagining slights where none exist. The difficulty," Major Forsyth continued, "is that her behaviour reflects poorly on Father Benedict. People who don't know the full situation might draw unfortunate conclusions. The man's reputation is spotless, but one disgruntled parishioner can create a great deal of unpleasantness." "Surely his reputation would withstand one person's objections," Miss Marple suggested. One would hope so, but gossip has a way of spreading, especially when the gossiper is determined to make herself heard. Not that Emily has said anything publicly, mind you, but her very absence speaks volumes, and not in her favour. Miss Marple found this interpretation fascinating. Emily Shaw's silence was being construed as a kind of accusation, while Father Benedict's silence was praised as dignity. The same behaviour, viewed through different lenses, produced entirely opposite meanings. Later that evening, as she sat with her knitting while Eleanor read, Miss Marple reflected on what she had learned. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Every conversation about the matter began with concern for Father Benedict and ended with criticism of Emily Shaw. And yet, when pressed, no one could provide any specific details about what had actually occurred. What they could provide with considerable fluency were interpretations. Emily was sensitive, spoiled, attention-seeking, prone to imagining offence. Father Benedict was kind, dedicated, burdened by ungrateful parishioners. These characterizations were offered not as opinions but as established facts, requiring no evidence beyond general agreement. Most telling of all was the way sympathy was allocated. For Father Benedict there was abundant concern about his feelings, his reputation, his well-being. For Emily Shaw there was only irritation at the inconvenience she had caused, and speculation about her deficient character. Miss Marple had observed this pattern before in different villages and different circumstances. It occurred when a community had invested deeply in a particular version of events, and found it easier to maintain that version than to question it. The investment was not always conscious. Often it arose from the simple fact that questioning one respected figure required questioning the judgment of everyone who had trusted him. And Lower Hartfield had trusted Father Benedict for 15 years. He had guided them through difficulties, settled their disputes, offered counsel in times of trouble. To suggest that this guidance might have been flawed, or that his counsel might have served his own needs rather than theirs, would require them to reconsider not just him, but themselves. Far easier, then, to conclude that Emily Shaw was the problem. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily in the quiet room. She had not yet formed a complete picture of what had happened between Father Benedict and Emily Shaw, but she understood enough to know that the village's interpretation was shaped less by facts than by convenience. Emily was young, unmarried, dependent on her mother's goodwill. She occupied no position of particular influence. Doubting her cost the village nothing. Doubting Father Benedict, on the other hand, would cost them a great deal. "You're very quiet this evening, Jane," Eleanor remarked, looking up from her book. "I was just thinking," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "about how differently we tend to view the same situation, depending on whom we wish to believe." Eleanor smiled. "You always were philosophical, though I must say in this case the facts seem fairly clear. Father Benedict has served this village faithfully for years. Emily Shaw is a troubled young woman who can't accept good advice when it's offered. Sometimes things really are that simple." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed gently, "sometimes they are. But not, she thought, in this case. Not when sympathy was offered in such carefully measured quantities, and not when the measure was determined by social position rather than by truth." The knitting needles continued their steady rhythm, and Miss Marple's mild expression gave no hint of the conclusion she was beginning to draw. Chapter 4. The Convenience of a Simple Suspect. By the end of Miss Marple's second week in Lower Hartfield, the village's attention had settled upon Emily Shaw, with the peculiar intensity that communities sometimes direct toward those who disturb their equilibrium. It was not dramatic attention, nothing so vulgar as open hostility. Rather, it took the form of heightened scrutiny, of small observations shared and magnified, of conclusions drawn from gestures and absences. Miss Marple encountered an example of this phenomenon quite by accident on Wednesday morning. She had walked to the post office to send a letter to her nephew Raymond, and arrived just as Mrs. Shaw was leaving with her shopping basket. The older woman looked even more strained than she had appeared in church, her face pale and her movements suggesting someone who carried a weight she could no longer entirely bear. Mrs. Hartley behind the counter watched her departure with an expression that mingled sympathy and something rather less charitable. Poor Mrs. Shaw, she said to Miss Marple, weighing out the stamps with unnecessary precision. Such a trial for her. First her husband's death 5 years ago, and now this business with Emily. It must indeed be difficult, Miss Marple agreed. The girl has always been headstrong, but this latest behaviour surpasses everything. Refusing to attend church, barely speaking to her own mother, walking about the village with such a martyred expression. Anyone would think she'd been genuinely wronged, rather than simply having received advice she didn't wish to hear. Miss Marple selected her stamps carefully before responding. Do you know what advice Father Benedict gave her? Mrs. Hartley hesitated, and Miss Marple observed the familiar struggle between discretion and the desire to establish a narrative. I couldn't say precisely, Mrs. Hartley admitted at last, but whatever it was clearly offered in her best interest. Father Benedict only ever wants what's best for his parishioners. He's guided so many people through difficult decisions. Why, when my own niece was considering accepting a position in London, Father Benedict helped her see that staying close to family was the wiser choice. She was grateful to him afterward, though she didn't realise it at the time. Your niece is still in the village, then? Oh yes, she works at the school now. Much better for her, really. London would have been quite overwhelming for a girl of her temperament. Miss Marple made a non-committal sound and gathered her stamps. As she left the post office, she reflected that Father Benedict's guidance appeared to consistently encourage people to remain within the sphere of his influence. Whether this was benevolent concern or something else entirely was a question that deserved consideration. That afternoon, Eleanor had arranged for them to take tea with Mrs. Venables, whose house proved as imposing as Miss Marple had expected. Their drawing room was furnished with considerable attention to propriety, and tea was served with the kind of formality that suggested its mistress took her social position quite seriously. 2 other guests had been invited, a Miss Caldwell, who taught at the village school, and a Mrs. Morrison, whose husband owned the largest farm in the district. The conversation inevitably turned to Emily Shaw. I saw her yesterday near the church, Miss Caldwell reported, her voice carrying a note of concern that seemed genuine enough. She looked quite unwell, thin and pale. I almost stopped to speak with her, but she seemed so determined to avoid company that I thought better of it. She wants people to notice her distress, Mrs. Morrison said with some tartness. It's a form of manipulation, really. If she were truly troubled, she would speak with someone about it properly instead of making these theatrical displays of suffering. Has anyone actually asked her what troubles her? Miss Marple inquired, knowing perfectly well what the answer would be. I attempted to speak with her last week, Mrs. Venables said, but she was quite uncommunicative. I expressed my concern for her mother's peace of mind and suggested that Emily might consider how her behaviour was affecting others. She thanked me very coldly and walked away. Most ungracious. Perhaps she felt the conversation was not addressing her own difficulties, Miss Marple suggested mildly. Mrs. Venables looked faintly surprised. But that's precisely the point, Miss Marple. Her difficulties, whatever she imagines them to be, are far less important than the harm she's causing to Father Benedict's reputation and her mother's health. A young woman of proper feeling would recognise that. Miss Caldwell nodded slowly. I must confess I've been disappointed in Emily. She was one of my pupils, you know. Always bright, always questioning. But intelligence without proper humility can lead one astray. She seems convinced herself that her interpretation of events is the only valid one. And what is her interpretation? Miss Marple asked. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence. She hasn't actually said, Miss Caldwell admitted. Not in so many words, but her behaviour suggests she believes Father Benedict treated her inappropriately somehow, which is of course absurd. Father Benedict has never been anything but correct in his dealings with parishioners. How do you know? The question, though gently posed, created a small ripple of tension in the room. Mrs. Morrison set down her teacup with a decisive clink. Because we know Father Benedict. We've known him for 15 years. He has guided this village through countless difficulties with wisdom and compassion. Are we to throw all of that aside because one troubled young woman decides to make vague implications? I wasn't suggesting that at all, Miss Marple said pleasantly. I merely wondered how one could be certain of what occurred in a private conversation between two people when only one of them is being asked for their account. Father Benedict has said nothing against Emily, Eleanor pointed out. Surely that speaks well of him. It might equally speak well of caution, Miss Marple observed. Silence can have many meanings. Mrs. Venables looked as though she wished to pursue this point, but tea had concluded, and the gathering soon dispersed. As Eleanor and Miss Marple walked back through the village, Eleanor seemed troubled. You're being rather hard on Father Benedict, Jane. He's not the one creating difficulties. I'm not being hard on anyone, Miss Marple replied. I'm simply observing that the village has decided Emily Shaw is at fault without actually knowing what happened. That seems rather premature. But we do know what happened. Father Benedict tried to help her, and she refused his help. Everything else follows from that. Does it? Miss Marple paused to admire a garden where late roses still bloomed. In my experience, Eleanor, when a whole community agrees on something without examining the evidence, is often because the agreed-upon version is convenient rather than true. Eleanor looked startled, then defensive. You sound as though you think Emily Shaw is telling the truth. I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that truth is often more complicated than we wish it to be, and that when someone is young, female, and socially vulnerable, it becomes remarkably easy to dismiss their grievances as hysteria or attention-seeking. But Father Benedict is respected, established, and trusted. Yes, I understand, which makes him a very inconvenient person to doubt. So the village has found a more convenient suspect. They walked the rest of the way in silence. Miss Marple knew she had unsettled Eleanor, but sometimes unsettling was necessary. The picture that was emerging troubled her deeply, not because she believed Father Benedict had committed any obvious crime, but because the dynamics she observed suggested something far more insidious, the slow erosion of someone's agency, justified as guidance, the requirement of compliance disguised as care. That evening, as she sat by the fire with her knitting, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the various pieces of information she had gathered. Mrs. Hartley's niece advised to stay in the village rather than pursue opportunities in London. Emily Shaw counselled about some unnamed personal matter and left feeling she had no choice but to comply. Father Benedict's presence at parish council meetings, offering his perspective on matters of community importance. Individually, these were unremarkable. A concerned clergyman offering guidance to his flock. But taken together, they suggested a pattern of influence that extended well beyond spiritual matters, and influence, when exercised consistently in one direction, began to look remarkably like control. The question was whether Father Benedict recognized this himself, or whether he genuinely believed he was simply helping people make wise decisions. Miss Marple suspected the latter. In her experience, those who gradually accumulated power over others rarely acknowledged it as such. They told themselves they were being helpful, that they understood what was best, that people needed their guidance. And villages, dependent on stability and reassured by authority, rarely questioned such arrangements until something went wrong. The knitting needles clicked in the quiet room. Emily Shaw had been convenient in every way, young enough to be dismissed as immature, troubled enough to be labelled unreliable, isolated enough to be easily ignored. The village had needed someone to be at fault, and she had been available. But convenience, Miss Marple reflected, was no guarantee of truth, and she intended to discover what the truth actually was, regardless of how inconvenient it might prove to be. Chapter 5, Virtue Discussed Behind Closed Doors. Miss Marple had discovered over the course of a long and observant life that the most revealing conversations often took place in settings that appeared entirely mundane. The village shop, the post office, the brief exchanges after church services, these were the places where people spoke with an unguarded quality they rarely displayed at formal gatherings, and it was in precisely such casual encounters that she learned the most about Father Benedict's role in Lower Hartfield. The opportunity presented itself on Friday morning, when Eleanor mentioned that she needed to call upon Mrs. Shaw to deliver some items for the church jumble sale. "I confess, I'm not looking forward to it," Eleanor admitted as they prepared to leave. "The atmosphere in that house must be quite dreadful. Mrs. Shaw looks positively haggard, and one knows it's because of Emily's behaviour." Miss Marple suggested, with the gentle persistence that was her particular talent, that she might accompany Eleanor. "I should be glad of the walk, and perhaps an extra pair of hands might be useful." Mrs. Shaw's cottage stood on a quiet lane near the edge of the village, its garden showing signs of neglect that suggested its mistress had little energy for such concerns. She answered the door with obvious reluctance, and Miss Marple observed the dark circles beneath her eyes and the way her hands trembled slightly as she accepted the bundle Eleanor offered. "How kind of you, Mrs. Dewsbury. I'm afraid I haven't been able to contribute much myself this year. Things have been rather difficult." "We quite understand," Eleanor said, though her tone suggested limited patience with those difficulties. "Is Emily at home?" "She's upstairs, reading, I believe. She spends a great deal of time in her room these days." Mrs. Shaw's voice carried a weight of unuttered complaint. "I do worry about her, shutting herself away like that. It can't be healthy, Bea." "Perhaps," Miss Marple ventured gently, "she finds it peaceful." Mrs. Shaw looked at her with something that might have been gratitude, or might simply have been exhaustion. "Perhaps, though I wish she would speak to me about what troubles her. We used to be close before she went away, but since her return it's as though there's a wall between us." "That must be very painful for you," Miss Marple said. "It is." Mrs. Shaw's composure wavered slightly. "And what makes it worse is knowing that it needn't be this way. If she would only listen to reason, if she would accept that Father Benedict was trying to help her, we could put all this unpleasantness behind us." "Father Benedict has spoken to you about the matter, then?" Miss Marple inquired. "He's been very kind. He called upon me last week to express his concern for both of us. He explained that sometimes young people resist guidance because they're not ready to hear what they need to hear. He said Emily might come to understand in time, but that meanwhile, I shouldn't blame myself for her stubbornness." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "That sounds very wise. Father Benedict has such insight into human nature." Miss Marple said nothing, but she noted the careful construction of Father Benedict's message. He had positioned himself as understanding and concerned, while simultaneously reinforcing the interpretation that Emily was being stubborn and unreasonable, and he had done so in a way that enlisted Mrs. Shaw's cooperation in maintaining that narrative. They took their leave shortly afterward, and as they walked back toward the village centre, Miss Marple remarked that Mrs. Shaw seemed deeply troubled. "Of course she is," Eleanor replied. "Her daughter is making life impossible for her. Emily should consider her mother's feelings." "I wonder," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "whether Mrs. Shaw has considered Emily's." Eleanor's expression tightened, but before she could respond they encountered Major Forsyth emerging from the Rose and Crown. He greeted them with his customary military courtesy and fell into step beside them. "Just been having a word with Thornton about his motor car," he explained. "The man insists on parking it in front of the post office, where it blocks half the pavement. I suggested he might show more consideration for pedestrians. He became rather defensive, I'm afraid. Some people don't take well to reasonable criticism." "Did Father Benedict offer any guidance on the matter?" Miss Marple asked innocently. The Major looked surprised. "As a matter of fact, he did. Suggested I approach Thornton privately rather than raising it at the parish council. Said it would be less humiliating for the fellow. Sound advice, I thought, though Thornton still didn't take it well. Father Benedict seems to be consulted on a great many matters," Miss Marple observed. "Well, naturally. He has excellent judgment. When there was that business about the school heating system last winter, Father Benedict helped to see that the expense would be too great. When Mrs. Caldwell wanted to introduce some modern teaching methods, Father Benedict explained why the traditional approach was more suitable for village children. He has a way of clarifying things, showing you what you hadn't quite seen yourself. What did Mrs. Caldwell think of his perspective? Miss Marple inquired. Oh, she accepted it gracefully enough. Father Benedict explained it all very reasonably. Said he understood her enthusiasm, but that innovation for its own sake could be disruptive. She's an intelligent woman. She saw the sense in it. Miss Marple wondered whether Mrs. Caldwell had actually seen the sense in it, or whether she had simply recognised that disagreeing with Father Benedict would be socially uncomfortable. But she merely smiled and allowed the Major to continue his discourse on the importance of stability in village life. It was later that afternoon when Miss Marple found herself alone in Eleanor's sitting room while her friend attended to some household matter that she made a discovery of particular interest. Eleanor's writing desk stood near the window, and upon it lay several papers that appeared to be correspondence related to village affairs. Miss Marple would not ordinarily have examined another person's papers, but one letter lay open in a manner that made its contents visible without any deliberate prying. It was from the vicar of a neighbouring parish dated some months earlier, and it concerned a request for a reference for Father Benedict. The tone was cordial, but the content was revealing. The letter explained that Father Benedict had been considered for a position at a larger church, but that the appointment committee had found certain aspects of his pastoral approach perhaps overly directive for a congregation that values independence of thought. Miss Marple read no further, but the phrase lingered in her mind, overly directive. It was a diplomatic way of describing what she had been observing, a tendency to shape others' decisions rather than merely advise them. That evening, Eleanor held a small dinner party, and among the guests was a gentleman Miss Marple had not previously met. Mr. Wickham, a solicitor who lived in the market town some 5 miles distant, but who maintained connections with Lower Hartfield through family ties. The conversation over dinner ranged across various topics, and it was during a discussion of legal matters that Miss Marple found an opening to pursue a question that had been troubling her. "I wonder," she said, addressing Mr. Wickham with polite curiosity, "whether you've ever been consulted by Father Benedict regarding parish affairs? I understand he sometimes acts as an informal advisor on quite practical matters." Mr. Wickham's expression became carefully neutral. "I have had occasion to speak with Father Benedict, yes, though I must confess I found his intervention somewhat outside the usual scope of clerical duties." "In what way?" Major Forsyth asked, looking interested. "Well, there was the matter of the Hendricks bequest 2 years ago. Old Mrs. Hendricks left a sum to the church with rather specific instructions about its use. Father Benedict felt those instructions were impractical and should be interpreted more flexibly. He asked me to find a legal justification for redirecting the funds. I had to explain that the will was quite clear and that flexibility wasn't an option." "But surely he was thinking of what would best serve the parish," Eleanor suggested. "Perhaps," Mr. Wickham said diplomatically, "though I did wonder whether best serve the parish and accord with Father Benedict's preferences had become rather too closely aligned in his thinking. A good clergyman guides souls. Father Benedict seemed rather interested in guiding everything else as well." There was a brief, uncomfortable silence. Then Mrs. Venables, who had also been, who invited, said firmly, "Father Benedict cares deeply about this community. If he takes an active interest in practical matters, it's because he recognises that spiritual welfare and material welfare are connected." "Quite so," Mr. Wickham agreed, though his tone suggested he was choosing not to pursue the disagreement. "I meant no criticism, merely an observation." The conversation moved to safer topics, but Miss Marple had heard enough to confirm her growing understanding. Father Benedict's influence extended into areas that had little to do with spiritual guidance. He shaped decisions about inheritances, teaching methods, even where people chose to live and work. And because he did so with apparent kindness and reasonable explanations, people rarely recognized it as the exercise of power it actually was. Later, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she reflected on the day's discoveries. Father Benedict's virtue was discussed constantly in Lower Hartfield, but always in ways that, emphasized his wisdom, his discretion, his invaluable guidance. What was never discussed was whether that guidance might have become a form of control, or whether his discretion might serve to conceal the extent of his influence. The village had invested so heavily in the narrative of Father Benedict as their benevolent shepherd that they could no longer see him clearly. His advice had become directive, his guidance had become requirement, his pastoral care had become intrusion. But because these transformations had occurred gradually, and because they had been accompanied by the language of concern and wisdom, they had gone unexamined. Emily Shaw had been the first person in years to refuse his guidance and make that refusal visible. And the village, protective of its comfortable beliefs, had decided she must be wrong. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and turned out the lamp. Tomorrow, she thought, she would need to understand more about what had actually passed between Father Benedict and Emily Shaw. The outline was becoming clear, but the specific details mattered. They always did, and in cases like these, where virtue was so carefully defended, the details were often quite different from what everyone assumed. Chapter 6. Kindness that required compliance. It was Miss Marple's habit, when pursuing an inquiry of this nature, to proceed with a patience that might have seemed excessive to those of a more impetuous temperament. She had learned long ago that truth revealed itself not through dramatic confrontations, but through the gradual accumulation of small observations, the careful noting of inconsistencies, and the willingness to listen to what people said when they believed they were discussing something else entirely. Saturday morning found her accepting an invitation from Miss Caldwell to visit the village school. The teacher had extended the offer quite casually after church the previous Sunday, mentioning that the building itself was rather charming, and that Miss Marple might enjoy seeing the children's recent artwork. Miss Marple had accepted with genuine interest, though her purposes extended somewhat beyond an appreciation of juvenile watercolours. The school was indeed charming, a stone building with high windows and the particular atmosphere of order and purpose that characterised well-run educational establishments. Miss Caldwell greeted her warmly and led her through classrooms that showed both care and modest resources. "We do our best with what we have," Miss Caldwell explained, gesturing towards shelves of well-worn textbooks, "though I must confess I sometimes wish we could introduce more modern materials. The children are bright and curious, and I think they would benefit from a broader curriculum." "I understand you proposed some innovations last year," Miss Marple ventured. Miss Caldwell's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Ah, Major Forsyth mentioned that, did he? Yes, I had hoped to introduce some new teaching methods. There's been quite progressive work done in education recently, particularly regarding how children learn to read. But it was felt that traditional approaches were more appropriate for a village school. By Father Benedict, I understand. Among others." Miss Caldwell moved toward the window, apparently absorbed in adjusting the blinds. "Father Benedict takes a keen interest in the school. He sits on the board of governors, you see. His opinion carries considerable weight." "Did he explain his objections to your proposals?" "Oh yes, very thoroughly." There was something in Miss Caldwell's voice that suggested the thoroughness had not been entirely welcome. "He felt that innovation could be unsettling for the children, that village families preferred familiar methods, and that my enthusiasm, though commendable, perhaps reflected insufficient understanding of local needs. He was quite kind about it, really. Made it clear he valued my dedication even while disagreeing with my judgment." Miss Marple recognised the pattern immediately. The appearance of respect, the acknowledgement of good intentions, the firm redirection disguised as gentle correction. It was the same approach Father Benedict had used with Emily Shaw, with Mrs. Hartley's niece, with countless others. "And you accepted his assessment?" Miss Caldwell turned from the window, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure wavered. "What choice did I have? To insist would have been to suggest I knew better than Father Benedict, better than the Board of Governors, better than the families whose children I teach. It would have made my position here quite untenable." "But you believed your ideas had merit?" "I did. I do." Miss Caldwell's voice dropped slightly. "But believing something and being able to act upon it are not always the same thing, are they? Particularly when one is a woman in a position that depends upon community approval." The acknowledgement hung in the air between them, and Miss Marple understood that she had found someone who recognised, at least partially, what she herself had been observing. Miss Caldwell had compromised not because she had been convinced, but because she had been, made to understand that resistance would cost her too dearly. "Emily Shaw was once your pupil, I believe," Miss Marple said, shifting the conversation in a way that might appear casual but was anything but. "Yes, 10 years ago, perhaps more. She was an excellent student. Quick, thoughtful, always asking questions." Miss Caldwell smiled slightly. "The sort of child who makes teaching a pleasure, though she could be challenging when she disagreed with something. She had a strong sense of fairness even then." "Do you know what happened between her and Father Benedict?" Miss Caldwell's smile faded. "Not precisely. Emily hasn't confided in me, but I can guess, perhaps better than most, because I've experienced something similar myself. Not the same situation, of course, but the same dynamic, which is the realization that kindness is being offered with conditions attached, that guidance comes with the expectation of obedience, that gratitude is required in exchange for help." Miss Caldwell's voice was quiet but steady. "Father Benedict is a kind man, Miss Marple, I genuinely believe that. But his kindness requires something in return. It requires that you accept his authority, defer to his judgment, and recognize that he knows what's best for you, better than you know yourself. And if you don't, then you're being ungrateful, difficult, unreasonable, and the community which benefits from his guidance and appreciates his wisdom will make you understand that such behaviour is unacceptable." Miss Marple nodded slowly. The picture was becoming clearer with each conversation. Father Benedict had constructed a system in which his help created obligation, and obligation created compliance. Those who accepted this arrangement were praised for their wisdom and maturity. Those who resisted were dismissed as troubled or immature. "Have you spoken with Emily since her return?" Miss Marple asked. "Once, briefly, I encountered her in the post office and asked how she was settling back into village life. She said something that struck me as significant at the time, though I'm not certain I understood it fully." Miss Caldwell paused, as though considering whether to continue. "She said, the difficulty with Lower Hartfield is that everyone believes they're helping you, even when they're hurting you." And then she apologised for being cryptic and left quite quickly. Miss Marple reflected on this observation with considerable interest. It captured precisely what she herself had been noticing: the village's absolute conviction that their treatment of Emily was correct, their loyalty to Father Benedict entirely justified, their dismissal of her concerns perfectly reasonable. They believed themselves to be acting properly, and that belief insulated them from questioning their own behaviour. The conversation moved to other topics, and Miss Marple soon took her leave. As she walked back through the village, she found herself considering the various elements she had gathered. Father Benedict's influence touched nearly every aspect of community life. His guidance was sought and followed on matters great and small, and because he exercised this influence with apparent kindness and reasonable explanations, because he never appeared to seek power overtly, it had accumulated almost invisibly. Those who benefited from the arrangement, and most people in Lower Hartfield did benefit from having someone to tell them what to think and how to proceed, saw only his helpfulness. Those who chafed against it were few enough and isolated enough that they could be easily dismissed. Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Shaw later that afternoon quite by chance near the church. The older woman was placing flowers on what appeared to be her husband's grave, and she looked so utterly worn down by care that Miss Marple felt compelled to speak to her. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Shaw. The flowers are lovely." Mrs. Shaw straightened, and her eyes brightened slightly at the human contact. "Thank you, Miss Marple. My husband was particularly fond of chrysanthemums. I try to keep his grave tended." "He's been gone 5 years, Eleanor mentioned?" "Yes, 5 years this November." Mrs. Shaw's voice wavered slightly. "He was such a support to me. I miss his counsel dreadfully, particularly now." "You must wish you could speak with him about Emily." "I do. He would have known how to handle her, how to make her see reason." Mrs. Shaw hesitated, then added, "Though Father Benedict has been wonderfully helpful. He's explained that Emily is going through a phase of rebellion. that young people sometimes need to reject authority before they can truly mature. He says I should be patient and not indulge her moods. What does Emily say about it? She won't discuss it. Won't tell me what she thinks Father Benedict did wrong, because of course she knows she can't justify her feelings. She just insists that she can't attend church anymore, that she can't be near him. It's all so vague and emotional. Mrs. Shaw's frustration was evident. I've asked her directly what happened, and she says I wouldn't believe her even if she told me. Which is nonsense, of course. I'm her mother. But Father Benedict warned me that she might try to create divisions between us, that it's part of her need to justify her own behaviour. Miss Marple listened to this with a sinking heart. Father Benedict had been extremely clever. He had positioned himself as Mrs. Shaw's advisor, precisely on the subject of how to handle Emily's concerns about him. He had framed Emily's silence as strategic rather than protective, her emotional response as immaturity rather than genuine distress, and he had enlisted Mrs. Shaw as an unwitting agent in isolating her own daughter. Mrs. Shaw, Miss Marple said gently, has it occurred to you that Emily might not tell you what happened because she fears you would side with Father Benedict rather than with her? Mrs. Shaw looked shocked. But I'm her mother. Of course I would believe her if she had a legitimate complaint. Would you? Miss Marple asked quietly. Father Benedict has been advising you for weeks now about how to interpret Emily's behaviour. He's told you she's being unreasonable, immature, manipulative. If she came to you with a complaint about him, wouldn't you be inclined to hear it through the framework he's already provided? Mrs. Shaw opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. For the first time, doubt flickered across her face. I would listen, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I would certainly listen. Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested very gently, you might try listening, without Father Benedict's interpretation guiding you. You might simply ask Emily to tell you what happened, and you might make it clear that you're asking as her mother, not as Father Benedict's parishioner. Mrs. Shaw looked troubled. You think I've been unfair to her? I think you've been told repeatedly that you haven't been, and sometimes being told we're right can prevent us from considering whether we might be wrong. Miss Marple left Mrs. Shaw standing by her husband's grave and walked slowly back toward Eleanor's cottage. The day had been revealing in multiple ways. She now understood the mechanism by which Father Benedict maintained his influence. He offered help that created dependence, guidance that required compliance, and kindness that demanded gratitude. Those who accepted this arrangement thrived within the system he had created. Those who resisted found themselves isolated, dismissed, and increasingly unable to make themselves heard. Emily Shaw had been the first person in years to withdraw her consent entirely, and the village, protective of its comfortable hierarchies, had chosen to interpret her withdrawal as wrongdoing rather than self-protection. The question now was how to make them see what they had been so carefully taught not to notice. Chapter 7, An Earlier Silence Recalled. Sunday morning brought with it a soft drizzle that blurred the outlines of the village and lent the air a melancholy quality. Miss Marple accompanied Eleanor to church as usual, and observed that attendance was slightly diminished by the weather. Mrs. Shaw was present, sitting alone in her customary pew. Emily predictably was not. Father Benedict's sermon that morning addressed the theme of forgiveness, with particular emphasis on the importance of releasing grievances and moving forward in charity. Miss Marple listened with the focused attention she gave to sermons when she suspected they contained messages directed at specific individuals. The vicar's tone was gentle, his examples drawn from everyday village life, but the underlying implication was clear. Holding on to perceived wrongs was both spiritually harmful and socially divisive. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the drizzle, Miss Marple noticed a woman she had not encountered before speaking quietly with Mrs. Venables near the church gate. The woman was perhaps 40, respectably dressed, with an air of having once been part of the village but no longer quite belonging to it. "That's Mrs. Fletcher," Eleanor murmured, following Miss Marple's gaze. "She lived here until about 7 years ago. Her family still has the house just past the green, but it's let to tenants now. She only visits occasionally." "What caused her to leave?" Eleanor considered the question. I'm not entirely certain. Her daughter had been quite unwell, I recall. Nerves or something of that nature. Mrs. Fletcher felt a change would be beneficial. They moved to her sister's place in Dorset. Miss Marple filed this information away with interest. A young woman who had been unwell with nerves, a family that had left the village rather suddenly. It might mean nothing, but then again, it might mean a great deal. She found an opportunity to speak with Mrs. Fletcher after. Eleanor had been drawn into conversation with the Mrs. Pemberton. Miss Marple approached with her characteristic gentle manner and introduced herself as Eleanor's guest. How pleasant to revisit old haunts, Miss Marple remarked. Do you come back to Lower Hartfield often? Not as often as I might, Mrs. Fletcher replied. Her voice carried a careful neutrality that suggested complicated feelings about the village. My tenants are quite reliable, so there's little practical need, but I do try to visit a few times each year. Your daughter didn't accompany you this time? Mrs. Fletcher's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. No, Sarah prefers to remain in Dorset. She's done very well there, actually. She teaches music now, has quite established herself. The move was beneficial for her. I'm so glad to hear it. Eleanor mentioned she'd been unwell before you left. Yes, Mrs. Fletcher glanced toward the church, where Father Benedict was still speaking with departing parishioners. She had a difficult time in her late teens. We felt a fresh start would help her recover, and we were right. She's quite content now. There was something in Mrs. Fletcher's tone that suggested she was choosing her words with considerable care. Miss Marple recognised the quality of someone who had learned not to say too much, who had found that discretion was safer than candour. Had she been under Father Benedict's pastoral care? Miss Marple inquired gently. Mrs. Fletcher looked at her directly, and for a moment Miss Marple saw something flash in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or warning. She had, Mrs. Fletcher said quietly. He was very attentive, very concerned for her welfare, perhaps too much so in the end. Too much so? Mrs. Fletcher hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. Then she said very softly, Sarah came to Father Benedict for guidance during a troubled period. She was questioning certain things about her future, about the expectancy placed upon her. He counselled her regularly, and at first it seemed helpful. But gradually Sarah became quite dependent on his approval. She would make no decision without consulting him, and when she did express thoughts that differed from his counsel, she became anxious and guilty. What did Father Benedict advise her about? Everything. Whether to continue her music studies, whether to accept an invitation to visit friends in London, how to spend her time, whom to associate with, even what to read. Mrs. Fletcher's voice was barely audible now. He meant well, I'm certain of that. But Sarah began to feel as though she couldn't breathe without his permission, and when she finally confided this to me, when she said she felt trapped by his kindness, I realised we needed to leave. Did you speak with Father Benedict about it? I tried. He was very understanding, very sympathetic. He explained that Sarah was going through a difficult phase, that young people often felt suffocated by the very help they needed most. He suggested that removing her from his guidance would be harmful, that she would come to regret it. Mrs. Fletcher's mouth tightened. But I'm her mother. I could see what was happening to her, so we left anyway. How did the village respond? They were sorry to see us go, of course, but the general understanding was that Sarah's nerves had made it necessary, that she needed a quieter environment. Father Benedict was very gracious about it all. He never said anything against us, which made it impossible to say anything against him. Miss Marple understood completely. Father Benedict had maintained his reputation precisely by being gracious, by appearing concerned and understanding even as a family fled from his influence. And because he had never openly criticised them, they could not openly criticise him without appearing ungrateful and unreasonable. Your daughter is well now? Miss Marple asked. She's herself again, Miss Fletcher said, and there was relief in her voice. It took time. She had to learn to trust her own judgment again, to make decisions without seeking approval. But yes, she's well, she's happy. I'm very glad to hear it." Mrs. Fletcher looked at Miss Marple with an expression that suggested she knew exactly why these questions were being asked. "If you're thinking what I suspect you're thinking, Miss Marple, I would only say this. Father Benedict is not cruel. He doesn't intend harm. But he's a man who believes absolutely in his own rightness, and that conviction can be terribly damaging to those who fall under its influence, particularly to young women who have been taught to defer to male authority." "Did you know Emily Shaw?" Miss Marple asked. "I've heard she's returned to the village, and I've heard she's refusing to attend church." Mrs. Fletcher's voice dropped even lower. "I'm not surprised, and I very much hope someone believes her, whatever she might say about what happened, because 7 years ago no one believed Sarah. They just thought she was troubled and that I was being overprotective." With that, Mrs. Fletcher excused herself, mentioning that she needed to visit her tenants before catching the afternoon train back to Dorset. Miss Marple watched her go and felt a deep sense of confirmation settling over her. The pattern was now unmistakable. Sarah Fletcher had experienced something very similar to Emily Shaw. Both had sought Father Benedict's counsel. Both had found themselves diminished by it. Both had become, in different ways, dependent upon his approval. And both had eventually recognized this dependency as harmful rather than helpful. The crucial difference was that Sarah Fletcher had had a mother who believed her and removed her from the situation. Emily Shaw had a mother who had been convinced by Father Benedict that her daughter was being unreasonable. Eleanor appeared at Miss Marple's elbow, looking slightly damp from the drizzle. "Ready to go home? I'm longing for a cup of tea and a warm fire." As they walked back together, Eleanor remarked, "I saw you speaking with Mrs. Fletcher. I hadn't realized she was visiting. Did she mention how Sarah is getting on?" "Very well, apparently. Teaching music in Dorset." "I'm glad to hear it. Such a sensitive girl." The move was probably the best thing for her, though I know Father Benedict was disappointed. He'd taken such an interest in her welfare. Miss Marple said nothing, but she thought about how Father Benedict's disappointment seemed to consistently involve young women who escaped his influence, and she thought about how the village interpreted those escapes as failures on the part of the young women rather than failures of his approach. That afternoon, while Eleanor rested upstairs, Miss Marple sat by the sitting-room fire with her knitting and allowed her thoughts to arrange themselves into a clearer picture. Father Benedict had created a system that served him beautifully. He offered help to those who were vulnerable or uncertain. He provided guidance that gradually became indispensable. And when people eventually recognized that they had surrendered too much of themselves to his authority, when they tried to reclaim their autonomy, he maintained his gracious demeanor while the village explained their departure as evidence of their own failings. Sarah Fletcher had been the earlier silence, the incident that had been absorbed into village law as a troubled girl's necessary retreat. But it had not been a retreat from nervousness or oversensitivity. It had been an escape from a relationship that had become controlling under the guise of care. And now, Emily Shaw was following the same pattern, except that she had nowhere to retreat to. She had returned to Lower Hartfield and found herself trapped between her need to avoid Father Benedict and her inability to explain why without being dismissed as unreasonable. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. The question that remained was how to make the village see what it had been determinedly not seeing for years. Father Benedict's power rested not on any formal authority, but on the community's willingness to accept his guidance without examination. Breaking that pattern would require someone to question whether his judgment was as sound as everyone assumed, and questioning Father Benedict in Lower Hartfield was proving to be almost impossible, because to doubt him was to doubt the wisdom of everyone who had relied upon him, and that was a far more unsettling proposition than simply dismissing Emily Shaw as difficult. But Miss Marple had not spent a lifetime observing human nature without learning how to navigate such situations. The truth would emerge, as it always did. It simply required patience, care, and the right conversation with the right person at the right moment. She set aside her knitting and gazed into the fire, planning her next steps with the methodical attention that had served her so well in similar circumstances. The earlier silence had been recalled. Now it needed to be understood not as an isolated incident, but as part of a larger pattern. And patterns, once properly recognised, were very difficult to ignore. Chapter 8. What had been protected at all costs. The revelation about Sarah Fletcher had crystallised something in Miss Marple's understanding, and she spent Monday morning considering how best to proceed. The difficulty, as she well knew, was that people rarely welcomed having their comfortable certainties disturbed. Lower Hartfield had built a collective understanding of Father Benedict that served multiple purposes. It reassured them that they had wise leadership, it simplified moral questions by providing a trusted arbiter, and it allowed them to feel secure in their judgments. Challenging that understanding would require more than simply presenting facts. It would require showing them what they had been protecting without realising it. The opportunity came quite unexpectedly that afternoon. Eleanor had invited several ladies for tea, and the conversation had turned, as it so often did, to Emily Shaw. Mrs. Hartley was expressing concern that the young woman's continued absence from church was becoming a scandal. "People are beginning to talk," she said, accepting a second cup of tea from Eleanor. "Not just within the village, but in neighbouring parishes as well. It reflects poorly on all of us." "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested mildly, "the solution is to understand why she won't attend rather than simply wishing she would." Mrs. Venables looked surprised. "We know why she won't attend, Miss Marple. She's taken some imagined slight and inflated it beyond all proportion. Young people these days have such an exaggerated sense of their own importance." "Do they?" Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "I wonder if we might be confusing importance with simple self-preservation." There was a brief silence. Eleanor looked uncomfortable, as though she could sense where this conversation might lead and wished to avoid it. "What do you mean by that?" Mrs. Hartley asked. "I mean," Miss Marple said gently, "that sometimes what appears to be stubbornness is actually the only protection someone has left. When a person's concerns have been consistently dismissed, when their interpretations of their own experience has been denied, withdrawing from the situation becomes not defiance but survival." Mrs. Venables frowned. "I hardly think Emily Shaw is fighting for survival. She's a young woman in a comfortable village with a devoted mother. Her difficulties are entirely of her own making." "Are they?" Miss Marple's voice remained pleasant, but there was a firmness beneath it. "I had an interesting conversation with Mrs. Fletcher yesterday. She told me about her daughter Sarah." The effect of this statement was immediate. Eleanor's teacup rattled slightly in its saucer. Mrs. Hartley's expression became guarded. Even Mrs. Venables appeared momentarily disconcerted. "That was years ago," Eleanor said quickly. "Sarah Fletcher's situation was entirely different." "Was it?" Miss Marple inquired. "A young woman who came to Father Benedict for guidance, who gradually became dependent on his approval, who eventually felt suffocated by his attention and had to leave the village to recover equilibrium. That sounds remarkably similar to what Emily Shaw is experiencing, don't you think?" "Sarah Fletcher was genuinely unwell," Mrs. Hartley protested. "Everyone knew she had terrible nerves. The move to Dorset was necessary for her health." "And yet," Miss Marple observed, "Mrs. Fletcher told me that Sarah is now perfectly well, teaching music, living independently, quite content, which suggests that what she needed to recover from wasn't nerves, but something else entirely." Mrs. Venables set down her teacup with a decisive click. "I'm not certain what you're implying, Miss Marple, but if you're suggesting that Father Benedict somehow harmed Sarah Fletcher, you're quite mistaken. He devoted countless hours to helping that girl. Her mother's decision to move away was a rejection of his counsel, and everyone could see that Sarah suffered for it initially." "Did she suffer?" Miss Marple asked. "Or did she simply go through a necessary period of adjustment as she learned to make decisions without seeking constant approval? There's a considerable difference." Eleanor intervened, her voice carrying a note of distress. "Jane, I really don't think we should be discussing this. Father Benedict's relationship with his parishioners is a matter of pastoral confidence. It's not appropriate for us to speculate." "I'm not speculating about pastoral confidence," Miss Marple said calmly. I'm observing a pattern. 2 young women, both of whom sought Father Benedict's guidance during vulnerable periods, both of whom subsequently found themselves unable to function independently within his sphere of influence. One escaped by leaving the village. The other has returned and discovered she cannot simply resume her former life because the situation that troubled her remains unchanged. "You've been listening to Emily Shaw's complaints," Mrs. Hartley said accusingly. "She's poisoned your view of Father Benedict with her distorted version of events." "Actually," Miss Marple replied, "Emily Shaw has told me very little. She said only that Father Benedict made her feel she had no choice, that disagreeing with him meant she was wrong. Everything else I've learnt through observation and conversation with others, including, I might add, Miss Caldwell, who described a remarkably similar dynamic when Father Benedict rejected her proposals for the school." "That's entirely different," Mrs. Venables protested. "Father Benedict sits on the board of governors. He has every right to express his opinion on educational matters." "Of course he does," Miss Marple agreed. "But Miss Caldwell told me something interesting. She said that to insist on her ideas would have been to suggest she knew better than Father Benedict, and that would have made her position untenable, not because her ideas lacked merit, but because questioning his judgment is treated as a kind of social transgression in this village." Eleanor's face had grown quite pale. "You're making it sound as though we've all been blind to something terrible, but Father Benedict has never done anything wrong. He's simply offered guidance, as any good clergyman should." "Has he never done anything wrong?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Or has the village decided he couldn't have done anything wrong because acknowledging otherwise would require too much rethinking of too many things?" The silence that followed was profound. Miss Marple could see the struggle in their faces, the desire to dismiss her observations warring with the uncomfortable recognition that she might be describing something they had indeed failed to notice. It was Mrs. Hartley who finally spoke, and her voice was uncertain. "What exactly are you suggesting Father Benedict has done?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said carefully, "that he has confused guidance with control, that he has made himself indispensable to people in ways that serve his need to be needed, rather than their need to grow, and that when people have tried to establish appropriate boundaries, he has interpreted their attempts as ingratitude or immaturity, rather than recognizing them as healthy self-assertion." "But he's so kind," Eleanor whispered. "Everyone says so." "Kindness that requires compliance isn't really kindness," Miss Marple replied. "It's a form of transaction, and the village has protected this arrangement because it benefits from it. Father Benedict settles disputes, offers counsel, provides certainty in uncertain times. Why would anyone want to examine that too closely when the alternative is having to make more decisions for themselves?" Mrs. Venables stood abruptly. "I think this conversation has gone quite far enough. You're a guest in this village, Miss Marple, and you're making very serious insinuations about a man who has devoted his life to serving this community. I find it extremely inappropriate." "I understand," Miss Marple said quietly, "and I apologize if I've caused distress. But I wonder if you might simply consider the possibility that Father Benedict's service to the community and his effect on certain vulnerable individuals might not be quite the same thing. One can be generally beneficial while being specifically harmful." Mrs. Venables left without another word. Mrs. Hartley followed shortly after, though she paused at the door as though she wanted to say something further, but couldn't quite find the words. When they had gone, Eleanor turned to Miss Marple with an expression of mingled hurt and confusion. "How could you, Jane? You've upset everyone terribly. And for what? Some vague notion that Father Benedict isn't perfect?" "Not that he isn't perfect," Miss Marple said gently, "but that his imperfection has been hidden behind respectability, and that hiding it has cost at least 2 young women their peace of mind. Possibly more that we don't know about." "But what do you expect to happen? Even if you're right, and I'm not saying you are, what good does it do to expose it now? It won't change what happened to Emily or Sarah. It will only create division and unhappiness." "The division and unhappiness already exist," Miss Marple pointed out. "They're simply being borne entirely by those who couldn't continue to pretend everything was fine. And as for what good it does, Eleanor, the truth always matters. not because it makes things comfortable, but because without it, the same patterns simply repeat themselves with new victims. Eleanor looked as though she wanted to argue further, but exhaustion seemed to overcome her. "I need to lie down," she said quietly. "I have a dreadful headache." Miss Marple watched her friend leave and then sat alone in the sitting room as the afternoon light faded. She had known the conversation would be difficult, but it had been necessary. The village had been protecting Father Benedict at the cost of those he had harmed, and that protection had been so automatic, so unexamined, that people hadn't even recognized they were doing it. Now, at least, the question had been raised. Whether anyone would be willing to pursue it honestly remained to be seen. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that sometimes simply asking the right questions was enough to begin shifting long-established assumptions. The truth had been protected at all costs. Now those costs were becoming visible, and the village would have to decide whether they were willing to continue paying them. Chapter 9: The Truth Spoken Without Indignation. Miss Marple had not expected her conversation with the village ladies to produce immediate results, and indeed it did not. Eleanor remained distant for the rest of that day and into the next, speaking when necessary but with none of her usual warmth. The atmosphere in the cottage was strained, and Miss Marple understood that her friend was struggling with the uncomfortable space between loyalty and doubt. It was therefore something of a surprise when on Wednesday morning Eleanor appeared at breakfast with a more settled expression and said quietly, "I spoke with Mrs. Shaw yesterday afternoon, after you'd gone out for your walk." Miss Marple waited, allowing Eleanor to find her own way to whatever she wished to say. "I asked her whether Emily had ever actually told her what happened with Father Benedict. I expected her to say that Emily had refused, or been evasive, but that's not what she said." Eleanor paused, clearly uncomfortable. She said Emily tried to tell her several times, but that she, Mrs. Shaw, had interrupted each time to explain why Emily must have misunderstood, or why her feelings weren't justified. She said she'd been so convinced that Father Benedict couldn't possibly have done anything wrong that she never actually listened to what Emily was trying to tell her. "That must have been a difficult admission for her to make," Miss Marple said gently. "She was quite distraught. She said she'd been thinking about what you said, about Emily not confiding in her, because she feared being disbelieved. And she realized that Emily had every reason to fear that, because it had already happened." Eleanor looked directly at Miss Marple. "I think I owe you an apology, Jane. You were right to push us to consider things we'd been avoiding." "There's no need for apologies between old friends," Miss Marple replied. "But I am glad Mrs. Shaw is beginning to understand. She's asked Emily to speak with her properly this time, to tell her everything, without interruption. I hope Emily will agree to it." Miss Marple hoped so as well, though she suspected the conversation would be painful for both of them. Still, it was a necessary beginning. What she had not anticipated was receiving, later that same morning, a note requesting her presence at the vicarage. It was delivered by a boy from the village and written in Father Benedict's own hand, expressing the hope that Miss Marple might spare him a few minutes of her time at her earliest convenience. Eleanor looked alarmed when Miss Marple showed her the note. "You don't have to go. You're not one of his parishioners. You could simply say you're occupied." "I could," Miss Marple agreed, "but I think I should see what he wishes to say, and I think it's time we had a direct conversation." The vicarage was a substantial Georgian building set back from the road, with well-maintained gardens and an air of quiet prosperity. Father Benedict received Miss Marple in his study, a book-lined room that conveyed both scholarship and comfort. He greeted her with his characteristic courtesy, though Miss Marple observed a certain tension in his manner that suggested he was not entirely at ease. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple. I hope I haven't inconvenienced you. Please do sit down." Miss Marple settled herself in the chair he indicated and waited. She had found over the years that silence often encouraged people to reveal more than questioning would. Father Benedict took his own seat and regarded her with an expression that mingled concern and something that might have been calculation. "I understand you've been taking an interest in parish affairs during your visit. Several people have mentioned conversations with you about various matters. I've had the pleasure of speaking with a number of people, yes? Miss Marple replied pleasantly. Your parishioners are very welcoming. I'm glad to hear it, though I must confess I've been troubled by some of the questions you've been raising. Questions about my pastoral relationships, my guidance of certain individuals. He paused as though waiting for her to defend herself. Miss Marple simply inclined her head, acknowledging his statement without confirming or denying it. Father Benedict continued, his tone remaining measured. I wanted to speak with you directly because I believe there may have been some misunderstandings. My work with parishioners is, by necessity, confidential, but I can assure you that everything I do is motivated by genuine concern for their spiritual and temporal welfare. I don't doubt your motivations, Father Benedict, Miss Marple said quietly. I'm certain you believe you act in people's best interests. Then why have you been encouraging people to question my guidance? Why have you been suggesting that young women like Emily Shaw have legitimate grievances against me? 'Cause I believe they do, Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but steady. Not because you intended to harm them, but because good intentions don't prevent harm when they're accompanied by a need for control. Father Benedict's expression hardened slightly. That's a serious accusation. It's an observation, Miss Marple corrected gently, and one based on a clear pattern. You offer help to people who are vulnerable or uncertain. That help gradually transforms into dependence. And when those people try to establish boundaries or make decisions you don't approve of, you interpret their independence as ingratitude or error. The villagers protected this dynamic because they benefit from your guidance, but the cost has been borne by those who couldn't continue to surrender their autonomy in exchange for your approval. Father Benedict rose from his chair and moved to the window, his back to Miss Marple. When he spoke, his voice was quieter. You don't understand what it's like to serve a parish like this. People come to me with every sort of difficulty. They ask for guidance. They beg for help in making decisions. Would you have me refuse them? No, Miss Marple said, but I would have you help them develop their own judgment rather than make them dependent on yours. There's a considerable difference between guiding someone toward clarity and making decisions for them. I have never made decisions for anyone. I offer counsel. What people choose to do with that counsel is their own affair. Is it? Miss Marple asked gently. Emily Shaw felt she had no choice but to comply with your guidance. Sarah Fletcher became so dependent on your approval that she couldn't function independently. Miss Caldwell abandoned ideas she believed in because disagreeing with you would have been socially untenable. These are not people who felt free to accept or reject your counsel. They felt compelled to obey it. Father Benedict turned from the window, and Miss Marple saw genuine distress in his face. I have dedicated my life to helping people. Everything I do is motivated by love for this community and its members. I believe you, Miss Marple said, and she meant it. But love without respect for autonomy becomes possessiveness. Guidance without boundaries becomes control. An authority that cannot tolerate disagreement becomes tyranny, no matter how benevolent its intentions. You make me sound like a monster. Not at all. You're a man who genuinely wishes to help others, but who has confused their welfare with their compliance. It's a common failing, particularly among those in positions of authority. But it's still a failing, and it has caused real harm to real people. Father Benedict sank back into his chair, and for the first time since Miss Marple had arrived, he looked less like a confident clergyman and more like a man confronting an uncomfortable truth about himself. What do you expect me to do? He asked quietly. I expect you to recognize what you've been doing. To acknowledge that your pastoral care has sometimes crossed the line into intrusion, and that your guidance has sometimes required surrender rather than growth. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but her words were precise. And I expect you to understand that when Emily Shaw withdrew from your sphere of influence, she was protecting herself, not rejecting legitimate help. The village will be furious if they think I've been... He trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. Inappropriate? No, I don't think they will be furious, because nothing you've done has been deliberately cruel or criminal. But they will need to reconsider how much authority they've granted you. and you will need to reconsider how you exercise the authority you have." Miss Marple paused, then added, "The alternative is to continue as you have been, protecting your reputation while more young women learn to avoid you. I don't think that's what you want." Father Benedict was silent for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "I genuinely believed I was helping them. Emily, Sarah, all of them. I thought I was providing the guidance they needed." "I'm sure you did, but the question isn't what you believed. It's whether your help actually helped, or whether it diminished them. And I think you know the answer to that, if you're honest with yourself." He looked at her directly, and Miss Marple saw in his eyes the struggle between self-justification and genuine self-examination. She could not tell which would win, but she had said what needed to be said. The rest was up to him. "I should like to speak with Emily Shaw," he said at last, "to apologize if she'll allow it, to acknowledge that my guidance was not what she needed." "That would be generous of you," Miss Marple replied, "though I think you should understand that Emily may not be ready to hear it, or may not accept it. An apology is about acknowledging harm, not about being forgiven." "I understand." Father Benedict rose, and Miss Marple did the same. "Thank you for being so direct with me, Miss Marple. It was not a comfortable conversation, but I believe it was a necessary one." "Truth rarely is comfortable," Miss Marple agreed, "but it's generally preferable to comfortable falsehoods." As she left the vicarage and walked back through the village, Miss Marple reflected that the conversation had gone better than she might have expected. Father Benedict had been shaken, certainly, but he had not been defensive or dismissive. Whether that would translate into genuine change remained to be seen. But at least the truth had been spoken calmly and without indignation, and that was often all one could hope for in such situations. The rest would unfold in its own time. Chapter 10. After Reverence Lost its Shield. Miss Marple's remaining days in Lower Hartfield passed with a quietness that felt less like anticlimax and more like the gradual settling of disturbed water. The village did not transform overnight, nor did Miss Marple expect it to. Change of the sort required here was incremental, uncertain, and often uncomfortable for all involved. Eleanor had thawed considerably after learning of Miss Marple's conversation with Father Benedict. "I'm still not entirely certain you were right to confront him so directly," she admitted over breakfast one morning, "but I can't deny that things needed to be said. Mrs. Shaw told me yesterday that she and Emily have been talking properly for the first time in months. Really talking, I mean, without Mrs. Shaw defending Father Benedict at every turn." "I'm very glad to hear it," Miss Marple replied. "What has Emily told her?" "That Father Benedict never did anything overtly improper, no scandal in the usual sense, but that he made her feel utterly inadequate to manage her own life. She'd come to him for advice about a position she had been offered in London, similar to what happened with Mrs. Hartley's niece, now I think of it. He counselled her very strongly against accepting it, said London would be overwhelming for someone of her temperament, that her duty was to her mother, that leaving would be selfish." Eleanor paused, stirring her tea thoughtfully. Emily tried to explain that she wanted the opportunity, but every time she raised the subject, Father Benedict would gently redirect her, remind her of all the reasons she shouldn't go, make her feel guilty for even considering it. Did she eventually accept the position? No, she turned it down and regretted it almost immediately, but by then it was too late and she felt trapped. She had surrendered her own judgment to his, and when she finally recognized what she'd done, she couldn't bear to remain near him, so she left the village. Anyway, though, without the position she'd actually wanted. Eleanor set down her teacup. When she returned, she was determined not to fall back into the same pattern, but refusing to attend church made everyone assume she was being difficult rather than protecting herself. Miss Marple nodded. The picture was now complete, and it matched precisely what she had suspected. Father Benedict's failing had not been dramatic or obviously cruel. It had been the steady erosion of others' confidence in their own judgment, justified as pastoral care. "Has Father Benedict spoken with Emily?" Miss Marple asked. "He wrote to her. A private letter. Mrs. Shaw said Emily read it, and then cried for quite some time. I don't know what it said, but Apparently it was some kind of acknowledgement. Emily hasn't responded yet, but Mrs. Shaw thinks she might eventually. The days that followed brought small signs of shift in the village's understanding. Miss Marple observed them with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had planted seeds and now watched them tentatively sprout. Mrs. Hartley mentioned, quite casually while Miss Marple was purchasing stamps, that her niece had been speaking of visiting London after all, just for a holiday, to see what opportunities might be available. "I used to think it would be wrong to encourage her," Mrs. Hartley said, "but perhaps young people need to make their own choices, even if we think they're mistakes. Otherwise, how do they learn?" Miss Caldwell stopped Miss Marple on the street one afternoon to say that she'd been reconsidering her proposals for the school. "I think I'll raise them again at the next governor's meeting. Not in opposition to Father Benedict, you understand, but simply as ideas worth discussing. It seems to me that education requires some willingness to try new approaches." Major Forsyth, encountering Miss Marple near the Rose and Crown, remarked that the parish council had been rather too deferential to Father Benedict's opinions lately. "Good man, of course, but he's a clergyman, not an expert on drainage systems or street lighting. We should perhaps trust our own judgment a bit more." These were small changes, and Miss Marple understood they might not last. The village's habit of deference to Father Benedict had been built over 15 years and would not disappear in a matter of weeks, but the fact that people were beginning to question, to reconsider, to assert their own views, suggested that the automatic reverence had at least been disturbed. On her final Sunday in Lower Hartfield, Miss Marple attended church with Eleanor and observed that Emily Shaw was present. She sat with her mother, and though her expression was guarded, she remained throughout the service. Father Benedict conducted the liturgy with his usual grace, though Miss Marple thought she detected a new quality in his manner, less certainty perhaps, or a greater awareness of the space between guidance and imposition. His sermon that morning was brief and notably different in tone from his previous offerings. He spoke about humility, about the importance of recognizing one's own limitations, and about how those in positions of authority must remain vigilant against the temptation to confuse their judgment with wisdom. It was not quite an apology, but it acknowledged, in carefully chosen words, that even those who meant well could sometimes cause harm through overreach. After the service, Miss Marple watched as Father Benedict spoke briefly with Emily Shaw and her mother near the church door. The conversation was short and appeared strained, but it concluded with Emily nodding and Father Benedict inclining his head in what looked like genuine respect rather than pastoral condescension. "I don't know if they'll ever have a comfortable relationship," Eleanor said quietly as they walked home. "But at least they're speaking. That's something." "It's more than something," Miss Marple replied. "It's recognition that Emily's perspective was valid, that her withdrawal was justified, and that Father Benedict's guidance was not infallible. Those acknowledgements matter enormously." That afternoon, Miss Marple packed her belongings in preparation for her departure the following morning. Eleanor helped her fold clothes and organise her small suitcase, and their conversation ranged over the events of the past weeks. "Do you think things will really change here?" Eleanor asked. "Or will everyone gradually forget and go back to how things were?" "Some of both, probably," Miss Marple said honestly. "People are remarkably good at maintaining comfortable patterns, even when they know those patterns are flawed. But I think enough doubt has been introduced that Father Benedict will be more careful, and people will be less automatically deferential. That's about as much as one can hope for in these situations." "I've been thinking about what you said," Eleanor continued, "about how we protect things without realizing it. I wonder how many other situations in the village we've been managing in the same way, accepting the familiar interpretation without examining whether it's actually true." "A great many, I should imagine," Miss Marple replied. "It's the nature of small communities, but that's not entirely bad. The familiarity, the accepted narratives, they provide stability and comfort. The difficulty only arises when those narratives prevent us from seeing actual harm." That evening, as Miss Marple sat for the last time by Eleanor's fire with her knitting, she reflected on the case, though she hesitated to call it a case in the traditional sense. There had been no crime to solve, no murderer to unmask, no dramatic revelation of hidden guilt. Instead, there had been the gradual uncovering of a system that had operated in plain sight, protected by respectability and maintained through collective unwillingness to question. Father Benedict would remain in Lower Hartfield, at least for now. The village had not turned against him, nor should they have. His failing had been human and understandable, a gradual corruption of good intentions rather than deliberate malice. But the automatic reverence that had shielded him from examination had been compromised, and that was crucial. Reverence unexamined could protect harm as easily as good, and when it was never questioned, it became dangerous to those who needed protection rather than deference. Emily Shaw would recover, Miss Marple thought, though it might take time. She had her mother's support now, and the village's judgment of her had softened. She would not receive apologies from everyone who had dismissed her concerns, but she had received acknowledgement from the person whose opinion mattered most. That would have to be sufficient. The knitting needles clicked steadily in the quiet room. Miss Marple had observed over a long lifetime that justice in these small matters rarely came in satisfying packages. There were no clear endings, no perfect resolutions. People continued living together in their villages, carrying complicated histories and imperfect understandings. The best one could hope for was truth acknowledged, harm recognized, and perhaps a slightly greater willingness to question comfortable assumptions. Lower Hartfield would go on much as it had before. The church would stand unchanged on its hill, Father Benedict would continue his pastoral duties, the village would maintain its rhythms and routines. But something had shifted, however subtly. The understanding that even respected figures could err, that even kind